and gardening. Environment Lethbridge acknowledges that we're gathered on the traditional lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains, and we offer respect to the Métis and all who have lived on this land and made Lethbridge their home. As environmental advocates, we understand that this place provides for the physical, cultural, and spiritual needs of the Blackfoot people. And as we look to the future, we hope this place and its people are cared for and stewarded by all with a spirit of reciprocity that sustains us for generations to come. We commit to an understanding of our role as treaty people and not to flinch in the face of history and to act in reciprocity with the land. So welcome to our third session of what I like to call the cabin fever gardening sessions. This one is about Waterwise vegetable gardening. And as we go through, I'll definitely be highlighting some interesting things about vegetable gardening, but mostly I'm going to be concentrating on how to cut your water with vegetable gardening, because generally vegetable gardening is an annual gardening activity, or a gardening activity that involves annuals, and therefore it is highly water intensive. So these are just some strategies that might help you limit your water. I just want you to know that I have been a gardener for most of my life. I built and maintained my own farm down in Cardston County that was fully resilient for my family of 3, and we are still eating raspberries from that farm. So we did a lot of work, and I've learned a lot living and working down here. So I hope to pass on some of that information to you. So today we'll talk about what gardening is like here in Lethbridge, the water-intensive nature of vegetable gardening, as I said, bed construction and placement, which is probably one of the most important things for success in your garden, whether it's urban or outside in the rural communities. Seeding versus bedding plants, this is a big deal when it comes to water. And water-wise crops and planting techniques, those are always really important. Culture and fertility, that's basically how you maintain your garden so that it stays growing and productive. And then water-wise irrigation methods, which of course are probably the most important thing that you can look at. And then I've also included some books at the end that may help you understand some of the topics and the things that we discussed today. And then of course we'll do our Q&A. So gardening in Lethbridge, we're officially a Zone 4B. That just changed over the winter, so we're getting warmer, but there are exposed sites in Lethbridge that are open to the southwest and that get extreme sun and wind are closer to a Zone 3. So I would never plant any perennials in those zones that weren't Zone 3. I don't think that they would survive a difficult winter, but certainly if you have some protected areas, we definitely can get into Zone 4 plants. We have a 4-month growing season, so from just the 3rd week of May through September, it's about just over 120 days from last frost to first frost dates, which makes our season quite short. We have extreme temperature swings in the summer and in the winter, as you can see today. Annual crops are water intensive, so this is an important thing to note. Any annual crop, anything that only grows for that 4 months, is meant to grow and produce seeds in a short period of time, so they do tend to suck up lots of resources. Hardy edible perennials are always more water-wise than annuals, so anytime you can use a perennial rather than an annual installation, you will save water. And many varieties of fruits and berries do well here. In fact, there are some raspberries that are, and gooseberries and things that are native to the area. And definitely when you're choosing your annuals, you want to choose annuals with a shorter maturation time. You're looking for optimal growth and production, probably around 60 to 70 days, but there's ones that are even shorter. And then consider your hardy vegetable perennials as well. There are a few that grow really, really well here. When we talk about annual and biannual vegetables, those are the ones that will set seed either in the same season or in the next season. They're water intensive because of their rapid fruit and root development, because we tend to pack plants into areas, and also because of our really extended sunlight hours up here in the north. In fact, the largest vegetables that are grown are generally up in the Arctic area in their summers because their sunlight almost never goes down. I've seen a picture of a 26-pound carrot up there, which is pretty impressive. Also, most of these plants have a high nitrogen uptake. They're meant to do it that way. And in our arid climate, they will increase their transpiration to attempt to cool themselves, which also makes it more difficult to grow and to be water-wise. Now, perennial vegetables and fruits are adapted to year-round growth, and the longer they grow here, the more they adapt to the arid area. So they tend to decrease their production when it does get really hot, so they're not as productive as an annual that is fed water and fed nitrogen, but they are a great option in many cases. So some of our greatest annual and biannual vegetables for this area are definitely lettuce, spinach, mustard, cilantro, parsley, and carrot. Parsley and carrot are biannual vegetables, which means that they won't set seed until the following year. But that picture in the background is a carrot plant, and I have to tell you that it's probably one of the most, I like to call it insect popcorn, because it's one of the most pollinator friendly plants that I've ever seen in my garden. They're quite a nice flower. They're shaped like a dill. So they tend to get a big poofy white flower on top. And if you can keep a carrot or two in your garden, they will produce a huge amount of flowers. And then all of those flowers get covered in insects and pollinators, and they will produce seed as well. So these are all great plants to put in your food forest, because you can keep one or two big seed heads around, and then that's your crop for next year, and you don't really have to worry about planting them again. But when we talk about water-wise vegetables, the best ones are your perennial vegetables. So I just wanted to talk about some of the perennial vegetables that grow really well here. Sorrel is one of them. Excuse me. I've never grown it because I'm quite an advocate of salad greens, so I tend to dedicate a lot of my garden to actual greens. My annuals are a lot of them are annual greens, so I haven't grown it, but I hear it's a really great plant, not just for eating as a green, but also for drying as a herb. Stinging nettle, which is the picture in the background, is, in my opinion, one of the most important plants for food, for fiber, for herbs. I love this plant. I had 5 stands of it at my farm. It is the first plant in the spring to come up, and for almost 6 weeks you can treat it like a spinach, so you can cook it down and put it into your soups and stews. I'm drinking nettle tea right now, actually. It makes a great tea. You can cook it down into your doughs. I've made bread with it. I've made cakes with it, bright green cakes. It can be difficult to grow in this area if it's not in an area that gets good water trapping, but it is without a doubt one of the best plants you can have in your garden. If you have a sunny garden with a wet spot, maybe it generally grows in disturbed wetlands, and it is just a fantastic plant. If you have any questions about how to handle it, I can definitely talk you through it after the presentation. Asparagus, of course, if you've lived here for a while, you know that it grows wild in the ditches, on the side of the highway, in the coulee. There's a ton of it just east of the Ag Center, or the Ag Research Center, just growing wild in the ditches. It is such a great water tolerant plant here, and it produces really well once it's established. Does want to be contained, of course, though, because once it really gets growing, it does take off. Most of these plants are that way. Chives are really great. What a great plant. Everybody should have them, especially if you have some shade. They're great shade color. They're great for pollinators. And the more they're in the shade, the less rapid they go to seed and start flowering, so you get to use them a lot longer. they're so easy to propagate. You just snap up one of the dried heads and plant it, and you'll grow another bunch of chives. Love chives. We actually grew them at the Fairmont Banff Springs as a shade aesthetic plant behind on the north side of the hotel. So I would really recommend chives for your garden. Sunchokes and Jerusalem artichokes, I've never grown them because I tasted them and didn't like them, but I really like the plant. They look a lot like a false sunflower, a perennial sunflower. If I can ever find a way to get my hands on the tubers, I'm definitely going to try them in my yard. Lovage is another one of my absolute favorites. They grow in big stands, and if you leave them alone, they can be 7 or 8 feet tall. But generally, once you learn to maintain your lovage, they won't be that high because you'll be constantly cutting them down until they get too woody to eat. But basically, they're so simple because as soon as they start growing their cane, you can chop them down, chop them up, and put them in the freezer, and they replace your celery. Celery is really tough to grow here. It takes a lot of water. So lovage, you can use the canes until they start getting woody. The leaves as a herb, it's one of my favorite pasta herbs actually, and the seeds for pickling. It has kind of like a mapley celery taste to it. Just a really phenomenal plant. And those big crazy beetles really like them. Rhubarb, I could write a whole book about rhubarb and what I've learned about rhubarb recently. It's a really interesting plant. It's a dynamic accumulator, so it grows really fast. You've probably heard that the leaves are toxic. I wouldn't say they're toxic for your garden. I use them in pathways all the time, so I just chop them off. I don't really like stewed rhubarb. I actually make it into a juice. And sometimes bake it into pies or crisps. But it's not my favorite eating plant, but the leaves themselves are great for pathways. You can put them down and then cover them with wood mulch, and it makes for really great biodegradable kind of sheet mulching. And honestly, they're so great for fruit trees to grow underneath, just to keep all of that accumulation going. And then if you've heard of walking onions, they're a perennial onion that as soon as they fall down, they reseed and they regrow. They're smaller than a globe onion, but they work great. You can eat the whole plant, including the small globe and the green. So if you can get your hands on some of those, they're really great as well. And then horseradish is another herb. I guess it's more of a canning vegetable. I've grown it once, but it didn't get big enough before we sold our place. I understand that once it is established, it's a bit crazy as well. So definitely keep it within a contained garden or a border. And then of course, dandelion. Dandelion is one of the most important pollinator foods. They're first foods in the spring. And if you leave the roots in the ground, they tend to get bigger and bigger and the plant gets bigger and bigger. There's always room for one dandelion in your garden. They speed up your tomatoes ripening. And once you harvest that root, you can definitely make a tea out of it. They were brought to North America as a vegetable to begin with. That's why they're invasive here. But can't say enough about those plants either. So if we move on to bed construction and placement, Waterwise gardening definitely starts with good bed construction and soil prep. And so it's really important to know that raised beds in a semi-arid area like Lethbridge will lose more water, particularly if they're made out of wood, than in-ground beds. Now, a lot of people can't get down onto the ground to do gardening, or they want a different look for their gardens. So if you do make a raised bed out of wood, consider lining the sides, and I'll show you a picture in the next slide, in order to keep the evaporation of water from that bed from going right through the sides of the wood. Particularly when it gets hot, really high raised beds can be a problem for water retention. It's so important that your beds are level, because you will lose the moisture to one end, particularly in the winter. And anytime you get huge precipitation, that water will just flow right off of it. So make sure your beds are level where you can. In-ground beds, it's really great to have a bed border, because it's helpful for keeping that water contained in an area. Water is hydrophilic and it likes to stay connected to itself in a border until that border is saturated, and then it starts to dive down to other layers. So not only that, it also helps you from walking on your beds, which particularly if you have clay, can be a problem for growing really robust plants. And then garden soil for annual gardening needs to be continually replenished. It's not like perennials where the plants will start to contain mycorrhizal nodes on their roots and go make their own food from what is present in the soil. Annual vegetable plants need to be given nitrogen sources in order to produce. So it's very important to constantly be replenishing your soil, and there's lots of different ways to do that. Here is a picture of a bed that's lined on the sides. Now you can also line the bottom with cardboard if you like. I prefer to have that communication between the soil layers. It's hard to break down cardboard in an arid climate, particularly through the growing season. But raised beds, definitely there are different types. Like this type is from Sprout Box. If you wanted to see these ones in the wild, they're actually a galvanized steel. And so they don't evaporate. They don't lose evaporation or water through the sides. They actually trap it. If you like that look, you can go see them in the wild at Winston Churchill High School. They were given a donation from Sprout Box for a certain portion of their beds, and they've put in a large garden installation there on the south side of their school. So go have a look at those. But they're a really handy one. And if you are going to invest in a raised bed, this isn't a bad one to invest in, simply because of the longevity of the steel. Now this is a raised bed, an entirely raised garden. So what happens here is it keeps a good boundary between the grass and the garden itself. Once you start watering, grass will want to come in and live in that garden and in that nice loose soil and grow in there with the vegetables. So it's nice to have a boundary between your garden and your grass. Or the rest of your yard. So this is one way to do it, where you put your entire garden in a border, and basically just mark out your pathways like they've done here. And also, we want to talk a little bit about partial shade. I have a bed now that in high summer only gets about 3 to 4 hours of sun a day, and it grows tomatoes and all manner of vegetables, even peppers. But in the spring, it gets quite a bit of sun. So partial shade beds will support growth, and definitely they work really well for those greens, the parsleys, the chives, the rhubarbs, the lettuce, all of those things that don't take a lot of water, but like the cooler temperatures of the soil during the summer. So don't count out your yard if you do get a lot of shade. You should limit your wind. Wind is the most destructive force when it comes to gardening, when it comes to establishing plants. And if you only have 4 months to establish your plants and grow vegetables, limiting wind with low fencing or some other strategies is a great way to ensure that you don't lose your topsoil and that your plants can establish quickly. The picture behind that you see here is a bed that's across quite a slope. You can't really see the slope, but it actually does go straight down. And putting a bed across the slope as kind of a level tier, is a way to catch surface water flow. Because of the nature of our soil and the nature of the arid climate, we tend, when we get moisture, to get a lot of it, and it tends to flow across a dry slope. So if you know moisture is coming, it's always good to give your bed a little bit of water so it can accept even more water, and to make some level areas like they did in the Andes, like they still do in a lot of mountainous regions, to capture surface water flow so it doesn't just cascade across the slope. And in-ground bed borders, I'll show you a picture in a minute, can be raised several inches above the soil level, which limits wind. If you have a barrier for wind, if the wind is coming from this side, the wind barrier, or the barrier itself, will protect for 5 times its height. So if it's this tall, it definitely will protect from the wind for 5 times the height of the fencing. And so it doesn't have to be a huge fence in order to protect the soil level of the ground. So here is just a shorter fence. It's about a 3-foot fence made out of, it looks like pallet halves, which is an inexpensive way to have some fencing in your garden if you do have an exposed site. These holes in the pallets are really great for wind fencing. You don't want to have a solid wall on a fence like this. This bit here is more of a solid wall, because what happens to the wind is it hits the wall, and then it starts getting really turbid, and it'll dump everything, dirt, weed seeds, everything on the lee side. So you'll get moisture accumulation, but you'll also get a lot of weeds. It's nice to slow the wind down, but not completely stop it, and you'll have less destruction on the other side of the fence. In this picture, you can see these bed borders, and these are the way I like to make in-ground beds as well, where they have a border so that you can use wood. Wood is straight carbon source, so having it around garden beds means that as it breaks down, it's going to take up all that nitrogen, it's going to take up all of that nutrient that you put in order to break down into the soil. So it's really great if you want to use wood chips in your garden, which are a really cheap thing to use in a pathway to keep your weeds down, to have a barrier between your garden soil and that wood chip, so that as it breaks down out here, your nutrients still remain available and your water sources remain available inside. But as you can see, there's about 6 inches or so of lip around these beds, and this is a great way just to protect your soil if you have wind coming in from this direction, because that 6 inches will protect 30 inches, so 3 feet, about almost 3 feet across your bed. So it's a really great way to keep moisture and to limit your evaporation from water if you're constructing some beds. Now, when it comes to seeding versus bedding plants in the spring, it can be difficult to start seeds, particularly if you don't have a space for it or you don't have the light for it. Even a really bright south window often doesn't grow robust tomato plants. They need full sun, and when you go into a greenhouse, you'll see how rich and leafy those plants are, and it's because they get so much light while they're growing from seed. But the thing about seeding plants is that seeding rather than using bedding plants is that you use less water early in the season. And not only that, your seeding plants will, they'll kind of adjust to the surroundings, to the climate that they're growing in. When you plop a bedding plant that has been raised in a greenhouse, it often is quite shocky for quite a long time. So if you can, using a reusable floating row cover or some kind of warming cover early in the season will improve your germination rates, and it will also decrease the evaporation that you use to set those seeds. So that's what I like to do, particularly with things like carrots that need some moisture in order to germinate. If you seed and then throw these covers over top, you really don't need to water hardly at all until those seeds germinate. It raises your soil temperature as well as decreases the amount of evaporation from the wind going over your beds. Also, when you're planting bedding plants, you need to make sure that they're properly root bound before you plant them so that they'll be successful. And also you need to ensure that they're hardened off. So there's quite a bit of work that goes into ensuring that plants that you buy for $5 each or however much you're spending on them actually work well in the garden. And seeds cost about $5 for years and years of plants, right? So in my opinion, if you can get the seeds to work, it works better for our climate than using bedding plants. But either way, there are ways to protect your plants when they go in. This is a floating row cover. They generally come in two different weights. One will keep your soil and plants warmer for 3 to 5 degrees below what the ambient temperature is. And the other one goes almost 10 degrees below. It's quite a bit thicker. Can't really use it in the summer because it'll overheat your plants. But they are great. You basically just tuck them in underneath the plants, weigh them down, and they keep all of that moisture and humidity and still let the light through. I've been using them for years and can't say enough about them. I also use them not only in the spring, but to extend the season in the fall. And I use them on my deck for my potted herbs and my annuals that I have out, just to give color in the backyard for a little bit longer. But they are really worth the investment. They're not too expensive. And generally you're moving them around the garden as your plants germinate. This is what I was talking about with a root-bound plant. This plant here on the left, if you see this type of root, it's not quite bound yet. It has just basically started growing. Planting this plant like this, you may have problems getting it to establish because of the hydrophilic nature of water. Generally, when water goes into a container, and a container can just be a type of soil, a type of aggregate that the plant is growing in, if it's different than the soil that surrounds it, you can trap that water right around the root of the plant and basically kill the plant. So you want to make sure hey, this is the only weekend I have and this is what I've got to plant, you want to knock off as much dirt as you can and work in the dirt that's in the garden into the root area as you gently plant it in. This one on the right is too root bound. It's been stuck in its pot for too long, and this will probably require some cutting and some massaging to get it to loosen up and stop growing in a big circle. And that can also cause top growth death as well as some shockiness. So, a happy medium between these things, but this one definitely is too young to plant. So just keep that in mind when you're using, particularly when you're worried about water use. You want to make sure that you have a good, healthy plant going into the ground. So some annual crops that I absolutely love that require almost nothing because they grow at a time when we do have water. One of them is garlic. If you like garlic, organic garlic now has a consistent $12 to $15 a pound. It's expensive. It is a difficult crop to grow for folks that grow it as a large amount of crop because it is so prone to allium rust, and so they have to be really careful when they're growing it. So if you can grow it, if you have enough space in your garden that you can rotate it on a 3-year plan so that it goes in a different spot for three years, you basically don't have to do anything. You plant it right before Halloween and harvest it at the end of July and let it dry and then cut it down, and you have it for the winter. It's so easy to grow. It's really good for your soil, in my opinion, keeps the bugs down, and I've been growing it for about 15 years now. Fall planted spinach. If you like spinach and you've tried and you just can't get it to grow because it bolts all the time, try planting it in the fall and try planting it with your garden or your garlic. These two plants really enjoy growing with each other. Spinach seed won't get eaten by mice like lettuce seed. Lettuce seed is very nutritious, and so mice will get into your garden and eat it if you try and plant it in the fall, even though it will grow over the winter. Um, but they don't eat the spinach seed. And so when you plant spinach in the fall, it starts to grow either in the fall or through the winter months, and then is established by the time spring comes. It starts to grow. And even if it starts to bolt, you can cut it down and it will continue to grow from the base, and you get those giant spinach leaves, and then it's basically done by July. But if you try and plant it when everybody else is planting in May, it gets too hot. It gets too hot at the beginning of June here, and it just basically bolts because the soil temperatures rise too fast. So consider planting it in the fall, and again, you almost have to do nothing with it. You just get this huge crop of spinach. Potatoes are another good one. You can grow it in the ground. You can grow it in your composter. You can grow it in a bin. You can grow it in a little fencing with straw. Potatoes are really fun. I don't grow potatoes anymore because I find them really user intensive, and because even organic potatoes are fairly affordable. But they're a very, very good water-wise crop. Beets are another one. Beets get quite a long taproot at the bottom underneath their big bulbous root, and they also grow that nice heavy-duty cover with the beet greens, which are also edible and very nutritious. And so they tend to keep a lot of humidity on the ground. So if you're using a lot of mulching as well, then they're a great crop to have in your Waterwise garden. Shade greens, lettuce and mustards, they tend to start bolting in July as well. So you want to make sure that you're constantly throwing seed every week and trying to throw it as things get hotter into the shade of other plants, just a little bit, so that you have constant lettuce all through the year. I wouldn't grow mustard past July just because it is a brassica and it wants to get eaten by everything, particularly the flea beetle that comes in droves in August. Onions are a great water-wise crop. They're like garlic. You don't want to overwater them because they do get rust and they do get moldy. So they don't need a lot of water. They just need a lot of mulching. And if we move on to techniques for decreasing water use, make sure you amend your beds in the fall or the spring. So late fall, you can put in unfinished compost from the city, dig a lot of that in, or manure in the fall, and then mulch it really well with leaves, and it will break down over the winter. So by the time you get your hands in the dirt in the spring, all of that will be broken down and it'll smell really good like soil. Or if you decide to do it in the spring, nice and early, like in March, put in a lot, dig over your beds and put in a lot of composted, really well composted manure or finished compost, so it doesn't smell. It doesn't smell like sour. You want it to smell like soil. When you're planting, make sure you adhere to the optimal plant spacing. The more plants you pack in, the drier everything's going to get. The more plants you pack in, the smaller your fruits are going to be. So you want to make sure you're optimally planting. Tomatoes are really hard because even if you use seed, or most people don't seed tomatoes because they don't have enough growing time. But if you put little plants in, it seems like they're so far apart. But really, when they start to grow, they need a good 1.5 feet, sometimes 2 feet, to get really robust plants on them. So make sure you space your plants out according to instructions. Attempt to use precipitation events whenever possible. So if you know you're going to get a big rain, try and go out and weed and throw some seed before that rain. That is probably the best way to optimize water as it comes out of the sky rather than out of your hose. And choose crops with shorter maturation times. So for example, this is Amish paste. It's aroma. It's actually got quite a short growing season for aroma. This one has a 70 to 75 days to maturation. But for me, that's a long tomato. This is one of my favorite short season tomatoes. This guy is 57 days. The early girl, it's a hybrid, so you can't really save the seeds from it. You'll get two different types of plants, but you'll get a really good crop when you grow them. The trouble with these is they're both indeterminate plants, which means they vine. So there's if I wonder if I could do something, but I only grow vining tomatoes because I find the shrubs take the bush type tomatoes, the determinate tomatoes take up too much room in my garden. So I grow three different types of tomatoes on one trellis, one 12-foot trellis. So I have 2 feet by 12, and I grow about 7 plants, and I prune them to 2 plants each, so there ends up being 14 plants in that space, which is more than you could plant. That might be a totally another webinar, but just try and choose plants that have shorter times for growth. Companion planting is the best thing you can do. The spinach and the garlic. I really like beans and basil together. I always grow tomatoes with calendulas and dandelions to increase their maturation times. But it doesn't mean you can double the amount of plants you have in your garden. It just means that you choose a crop that you're going with, and you're putting in some plants to assist with their maturation and their growth. So that companion plant isn't a crop plant. It's just an assistant plant. You maybe have heard of the book Carrots Love Tomatoes. I always plant carrots with my tomatoes. The carrots are sweet when they're done, but they're stunted, so you don't get really great carrots when you grow them at the base of a tomato plant. But the tomato is better when you grow the carrots. So sprinkling just a little seed around the bottom. There's so many great resources for companion planting. You just have to be careful that you're choosing plants that will grow here. I find that most garden advice comes from the coast, or it comes from lower regions that don't have our challenges here. Lethbridge has a very challenging environment to grow in. So it's best to know what grows well here and what will augment your plant as well as your garden and what you need. And as always, choose seeds over bedding plants whenever possible and thin them. That decreases your water use exponentially. So, mulch is my life. You'll hear that if you ever hear me talking about gardening. Mulch is my life. I mulch everything. If you go out into the forest, you'll notice that the forest floor is so soft, and it's because all of that deadfall, everything that comes down from the trees in the forest, keeps that ground cover so nice and light, and it keeps the ground nice and covered and protected. So we want to do the same thing in our garden, but you don't want to use mulches too early, because you do need a higher soil temperature for your seeds to germinate. So as soon as daytime temperatures are consistently at 25 degrees, usually by the first week of July, that's when you can start mulching heavily with like big handfuls of straw. And I use straw just because it has seed in it, and it produces wheat plants that are really easy to weed, so they become kind of a composting plant. And so not only do you have nice good carbon source crust on top of your plants, but you also have some nitrogen in plants that you can just pull and drop on top. They're really easy to spot. So I recommend straw from UFA. It's just a bedding straw for chickens. It's very, very hard to find organic straw because most organic producers will use their own straw. They'll either till it in or use it themselves. But you can find the wash straw at UFA, and it's much cheaper than buying it at Canadian Tire. Just there's a tip for you. I would use no-till techniques as soon as mid-spring comes, and stop digging in your garden to keep that moisture in the garden. So chop and drops, pull and drops, just leave everything on top of the soil. You can get it out after, or you can move it right to your green bin if you don't want it in your crops. And using self-sowing annuals, both vegetables and pollinator-friendly flowers, as we said in the beginning, your carrots and your parsleys and your lettuces, if you leave the seed heads there, it decreases your workload and it allows those plants to grow where they are optimized for their own conditions. And if you can, save successful crop seeds. So if we have a super hot year, but you still got a pretty good pea crop, save those pea seeds if you can, because those are the plants that are going to be stronger in the future. So you might want to choose some heirloom varieties. That's hard with tomatoes because the heirlooms like have 120-day maturation times and you won't even get a single tomato. Now this is my favorite thing, the Oya. This picture in the back is a terracotta pot that's hollow and it has a tube, and they get buried into your garden, and basically you plant plants around them and the plant takes the water right through the terracotta. They're an unfinished terracotta pot. These were developed in the low-lying California areas in New Mexico and Mexico and South America for extremely arid regions trying to grow production plants. They actually use them to set trees. They use them constantly through gardening seasons. Up here, it's a little trickier because you need to place them after our last frost and pull them out before first frost so that they don't crack, because once they're cracked, they're useless or they need to be fixed. But they're great for things like tomatoes and peppers and any of those really hothouse like squash and cucumbers, those hothouse varieties, to really limit the amount of water that you're using. Now these guys are pretty expensive, but you can make one. I've actually got one over here. One moment. It was a gift. This is two 6-inch terracotta pots glued together with food safe adhesive, and that's the trick. That's what makes even these ones really expensive. And the bottom is glued on and it's just left a hole in the top. So you bury that whole thing and you can bury it into a big pot or into your garden itself and plant 4 plants around it and just fill up the water once a week. And that's maybe 1.5 liters of water in there. They're amazing. But again, good care is crucial for longevity. And these fired ones are very expensive. The bigger ones cost $60 to $100. So they're hard to find. They're much easier to use with your bedding plants. So when you put your bedding plants in, when everything's nice and warm, when the soil temperature is above 10 degrees, they work really well that way. And they shouldn't be placed too early in the year because we can get some cold temperatures that might freeze them and break them. And you'll want, of course, to drain them and dry them before you put them in your shed. But you can get 3 or 4 plants around each Oya. I've seen them in raised tire beds that grow incredible amount of food. I'm actually shocked by it. And they can be purchased or you can make them yourselves. Of course, they lose effectiveness as soon as there's a crack because then the water all rushes out. So you have to use waterproof, food-safe glue, which is also hard to find. But they're a really fabulous option for container gardening. If you have some of those big tree pots, putting one of those in the center and with 3 plants around it, and you'll get better food and better cucumbers or tomatoes if you're growing than you would watering from the top. Okay, how are we doing? Oh, it's going on long. We're almost done, folks. Sorry. So culture and fertility, this is something from like long-term work in landscape management. Weed, water, mulch. Weed, water, mulch. So if you know there's a big event of precipitation coming, try and weed before that. Loosen your soil a little bit. Lever out the weeds. Leave those holes open. Let the rain happen, and you'll get much better retention of that water in your soil. And then if there is no water or rain coming, you want to weed, hand water, and then mulch every single time. That straw mulch breaks down pretty fast in your garden. It never hurts to have more right up the edges of the plants. Really protects not only your soil, but the plants as well. But again, don't mulch until the temperatures are high enough that you start protecting the soil rather than stopping it from getting warmer so that you have your germination. I put in, don't insert your bedding plants until they're hardened off and soil temperatures are above 10 degrees Celsius. This isn't really a Waterwise technique. It's just a financial technique because you'll probably lose your plants. If you're not sure about hardening off, definitely put a question in the chat and I can talk about that after we're done here. And then using a compostable crop like straw mulch is really great for the summer season because it's easy to weed. Using grass clippings is another great one, but you could end up with grass in your garden, which isn't optimal because it is a little bit harder to weed out. But again, nice high nitrogen cover crop for sure. And then if you can, using hydrated fertility is much better than granular fertilizer if you're using it. Compost teas are fabulous. They're really kind of low dose nitrogen, but they really add to the soil. So if you're looking into that, getting into that kind of stuff, water solubles, right after you weed, hand watering with a hydrated fertility is the best way to get that moisture down into the ground and have it useful to your plants. And then here are some steps for success for Waterwise irrigation. You have to irrigate anyway if you're growing crops, but never ever irrigate in the sun. If you can do that, you're going to save yourself so much water. The plants will look like they need water because they close their stomata, and the most dramatic of them all are the squash, pumpkin leaves. They tend to close their stomata in the heat of the day at about 3 o'clock and they look like they're dying. They're not dying. Just wait until it's cooler. Wait until your garden goes back into shade or the sun is almost down and you'll see them perk right back up again. Always check your soil before you water to make sure that you even need water. If you're sticking your finger down and you can squish the soil together at 2 inches, it doesn't need water. Your plants, their roots will go down 1.5 to 2 feet. So if you can get them to dive down, they're more resilient plants, they're hardier, and you just will limit your water. By doing a soil sedimentation test, you can determine your soil type. This is really for heavy clay folks who have heavy clay gardens. You can jump for joy because clay has a lot of nutrient in it, but you have to be super careful that you don't overwater because you can cause a lot of problems with your plants. Clay can only accept so much water, so shorter bursts of water just to keep the clay damp. You never want it to dry out, so don't step on your clay. Hand watering is always more effective and use less water than sprinklers, so consider using a wand instead of a sprinkler and go for a walk around your garden every day or every other day. It's great to get it down to every other day in the summer. And soaker hoses, everybody thinks they're so great with water. They're not because you can forget about them so easily. They try to use a timer with them. And then here are some resources. So if you're not on West Coast Seeds, they're like Bernardin for people who are just starting to can. This is their growing guide that they send out every year. I shouldn't really use it because I should cancel my growing guide because I tend to use the online one, but they're so great. There's the sheet to, that's what's in the background there on the prairies, when to plant. So helpful, makes your job so much easier. They also have a guide to companion planting. That's great. Gardening with less water. This is all about the Oyas and down in California and all the work that they've done with various ways of using buried water techniques. So interesting. This is at the library. I'll take it back right away. The Year-Round Vegetable Gardener. I didn't really like this book for its advice, but I do love the beds. There's some beautiful beds in there and bed construction if you're interested. And then I don't have Carrots Love Tomatoes here, but there are so many great gardening books at the library if you're at all interested. And here we are. So I'm going to open up, see if I can open up my chat again.